Okay, so now we are getting to the programming part in which we will actually implement in Java how to talk to our Elasticsearch cluster. So the first thing I have to do is copy this Maven configuration for the dependency. And so by going into IntelliJ, we're going to create a new module and we'll click next. And this one is called Kafka Consumer Elasticsearch. Then click on next and the module, we can just add the missing hyphens. Okay, click on finish. And here we are. So we have a Kafka Consumer Elasticsearch project right here, and we have a pom.xml under which we are also going to include some dependencies and the newly acquired Elasticsearch dependency. From the previous examples, we can use, for example, as well, the Apache Kafka dependency and SLF4j. So I will go ahead and include those into my pom.xml, and we should be ready to start programming. Now, under this project, I am going to add a Java directory, and I will call it com.github.simplesteph.kafka. Underneath, I'll go and create a new package. This is my tutorial 3. And underneath, I will create a new Java class, and we'll call this Elasticsearch Consumer. Okay, so here we have our class, and I will have my main method. And so because I think this is extremely boring, I will go ahead and copy and paste some code I've already created and explain it to you because there's no Kafka interest to connect to Elasticsearch so far. Okay, so the first thing I'm doing is creating a function called createClient. And this will basically create an Elasticsearch client. And so we'll have to give the hostname, the username, and the password. And so let's look at what this code does. The first thing I do is that I create a credentials provider. Now, this is only because we run in the cloud, and in the cloud, there's a secure mode right now with Bonsai, but if you run a local Elasticsearch, then you probably don't need that whole thing. Then I create a REST client builder. And this REST client builder basically says we're going to connect over HTTP to the host name we indicate right here, so we'll indicate it in a second, over the port 443, so it's HTTPS. So it's an encrypted connection to the cloud, which I think is quite real world. Now we have a HTTP client config callback, and this config callback basically says to apply the credentials to any HTTP calls. So basically we're saying connect to this hostname over HTTPS and use these credentials. What we return at the end is just a REST high-level client, which allows us to insert data into Elasticsearch. Now, as far as the hostname, username, and password go, then we have to go back to our access tab from the Bonsai Elasticsearch cluster. And from there, we are going to get the host name, the username, and the password. So let me copy this whole thing, get back to here, and we'll just extract the point we need. So the host name is going to be this entire thing right here. If you have localhost, if you're running something locally, then localhost. The username is going to be the first part, and the password is going to be this. So obviously here, you're going to have to replace with your own credentials. These will be invalidated at the end of this course, so don't worry. So here we go. You replace this with your own credentials. And so this is enough for us to create clients. So now if we go ahead and say REST high-level client equals create client, then we have something to play with and start inserting data. So now if we want to go ahead and insert some data, how do we do this? Well, it's pretty easy. First, we have to create something called an index request. So we'll call this an index request. And we create a new index request object. Now this takes 3 parameters. It takes an index, a type, and an ID. So for index, we'll say we want to talk to the Twitter index. And for the type, we want to talk to the tweets type. And the ID for now, let's say we don't include any ID. So here is an index. Now this index request will fail unless the Twitter index exists. So to make sure that it exists, we go to our interactive console, and from there, we will do a put on /Twitter. And this will create the index as we've seen before. So yes, now the index has been created. If you run it a second time, you will get a 400 saying the resource is already existing, which is good, okay. So now we have an index request, and we are going to say we're going to put some data into Twitter tweets. Okay, so far so good. Now what we need to do is actually sending some data and adding some source. So before the semicolon, you do .source, and here we can include a JSON string. So to be easy, we're going to create a string, and we'll call it JSON string. And we have to create that JSON string. Now, because this is Java, we have to escape any quotes character. So far, I'll just say foo and bar. So I'll escape this one bar. We close it and we close the quotes. So in Java, if you don't know, if this is beginner for you, I'm sorry, but basically you need to escape any double quotes if you use double quotes outside. So this is a string saying foo bar, and this is what we're going to use in our source, so JSON string. We also have to add a second argument to our JSON string, and this is xContent type JSON to say that we're indexing JSON documents. So this is our index request, and now we actually have to run it. So to run it, pretty easy. We need to run it using a client. And so for this, we'll say index response. That's our index response equals client dot index, and we pass in the index request. So request, and then some request options. And for this, we can use request options dot default. Okay. Now we do get a unhandled exception called IO exception. So let's just have it here, and we'll add it to the method signature. So that is right here, throws IO exception. And so now with this index response, we basically can get an ID out of it. So we can say string ID equals index response dot get ID. And here we go. We can go ahead and do logger. So we need to create a logger, obviously. So let's go ahead and create a logger. That's my logger equals logger factory dot get logger. And we'll pass in the class name, Elasticsearch consumer dot get class dot get name. Okay, here we go, and we import the logger. So now we can say logger dot info, and we pass in the ID. Finally, because we want to be very clean, at the end we do client dot close to close the client gracefully. Okay. So all this should just do one thing, is to insert one JSON document into our index, and we get back the ID from it. Now let's run this code. And as we can say, yes, this whole thing is the ID of our document. So let's verify it worked. Let's go to Elasticsearch and do a get on Twitter /tweets/ and the ID we just had. We run it, and we can see that yes, the tweet has been inserted. It's not really a tweet right now, it's just a dummy JSON document, which is foo bar. And so that's pretty nice right here. The foo bar we had created from before is in there. Now, obviously, if you go and run this code a second time, we are going to get a new different ID right here. And so this will be a second kind of tweet, okay, but with the exact same content. So as you can see, the more we run this code, the more data is going to be inserted into Elasticsearch. That may be a problem later, but for now, we're very happy. We have managed to insert data into Elasticsearch. Now in the next lecture, we'll go ahead and wire that up with a Kafka consumer to insert data from our tweets topic into Elasticsearch. So see you in the next lecture.